I guess we'll get started here. I'm gonna keep an eye on my sound bars here just in case anything gets broken up or I have to adjust anything. So I apologize if it looks like I'm not looking right at you guys. I have two screens to watch here. Welcome. For folks who don't know me, I'm Becky Parker. I'm the coordinator of the Nova Scotia Young Naturalists Club. And if you're just joining us for your first session today, this is how we're adapting to COVID-19. Normally, we would be getting outside and enjoying the nature around us in our groups. We're a chapter-based organization with great volunteers around the province that lead us on really cool hikes on a monthly basis. And of course, we can't do that right now. So we thought some trivia would be the way to pass the time. And we're really lucky to be joined by a couple awesome conservation professionals around the province for this series who are telling us all about their work, what they're doing with species at risk, and a little bit of how you guys can help at home. I'm going to let Melissa take over our screen here. Just bear with me a sec, and I'll let her introduce herself. Melissa is from Coastal Action Foundation. She's one of my very good friends, and she's going to tell us all about the Atlantic Whitefish. All right, Melissa, you're up. You can go ahead.
Hi, everybody. I hope you can hear me okay. So my name is Melissa, and I'm the Atlantic Whitefish Recovery Project Coordinator at Coastal Action. Our group is a charitable organization that addresses environmental concerns within the South Shore region of Nova Scotia, and our goal is to promote the restoration, enhancement, and conservation of our environment through research, education, and action. So if you saw last week's presentation, you would have heard a little bit about our organization and Coastal Action's work on the American eel. So today I'm going to share with you our work on a different project, which is Atlantic Whitefish Recovery. I'm going to go through a little presentation about Atlantic Whitefish, and then we'll have a trivia competition. So I'm going to share my screen, so you'll be able to see my my PowerPoint presentation and a few photos. Okay. Okay, so the Atlantic whitefish is a unique fish species that only lives in 3 lakes in Nova Scotia and nowhere else in the entire world. They're a salmonid species, and they're closely related to salmon and trout. If they were currently able to complete their life cycle properly, they would hatch from an egg in fresh water, and the larval fish would travel downstream to the ocean. And when they're ready to spawn, the adult fish return to freshwater, the same freshwater body, to lay their eggs. But this form of life history strategy is known as anadromy. So if you were here for last week's presentation about the American eel, you would have learned that this is the opposite of the American eel's life history strategy, which is catadromy. This is a map of Nova Scotia showing the 2 watersheds in Nova Scotia where Atlantic whitefish have been found. So the red is the Tusket River watershed in Yarmouth County, which used to host a fully anadromous population of Atlantic whitefish, but there's been no sightings there, unfortunately, in that system since 1964, or in the neighboring Annis River, which is right next to the Tusket River, since 1982. And the Atlantic whitefish is now considered extirpated from that system, which means that they don't exist there anymore, but they do exist elsewhere. So the yellow is the current and only home of the Atlantic whitefish, which is the Petite Riviere watershed in Lunenburg County. So there is no wild population outside of this system in the whole world. That's the only place where they live. So this is a zoomed in map of the Petite Riviere watershed. So the yellow line is the watershed boundary. Just to get you oriented, if you look at the top of the map, there's Bridgewater, and then the large river on the right-hand side is the Lahave. So the lakes in light blue are the only lakes that are now known to host a wild population of Atlantic whitefish. So there's Heb Lake, Lipscott Lake, and Minanke Lake. These three lakes are protected as critical habitat by the federal government's Species at Risk Act. I hope you guys can see this video. This is a video of a school of adult Atlantic whitefish feeding. This was taken in 2014. Atlantic whitefish usually eat small forage fish, zooplankton, and insects. There's other fish that you can also find living in Atlantic whitefish habitat in the Petite Riviere watershed. And these include the American eel, which you would have heard about last week if you tuned into last week's presentation. There's white sucker, yellow perch, white perch, and brown bullhead. Okay. So this slide is just about how you can identify an Atlantic whitefish and its lookalike. So this picture is of an Atlantic whitefish, and I want to point out a couple important features that you can use for identification. So they have silvery sides, a silvery white underbelly, and a darker sort of silvery blue back. They have an adipose fin, which is a little bit hard to see in this picture because of the angle, but that's just a little fleshy fin that's between the tail and the dorsal fin on the dorsal side of the fish. And all salmonid species actually have this. The mouth is a terminal mouth, which means that the lower jaw and the upper jaw match and have a deeply forked tail. There is another fish in Nova Scotia that looks quite similar, and that's the lake whitefish. So if you're fishing in Nova Scotia, it's really important to know how to tell the two apart. And a really easy way to do that is if you're fishing in the Petite, it's probably an Atlantic whitefish, but if you're somewhere else and you're trying to figure out what you've got, if you look at the mouth of a lake whitefish, you can look at the lower jaw, and you can kind of see it in this picture. The lower jaw doesn't quite match the upper jaw, whereas in the Atlantic whitefish, they do match. So I said that there's only the one wild population in the Petite, and unfortunately, even though that they're landlocked in those small lakes, and they're not able to access the ocean, the home in the Petite Riviere is not safe for them indefinitely. They're officially designated as an endangered species for quite a few reasons. Firstly, there is a very small wild population, and the exact population is not known. There's several dams in the Petite system. This is one of them. This is Heb Dam at the foot of Heb Lake, and there was no upstream passage along the Petite River into the upper lakes, like starting at Heb Lake, since the installation of Heb Dam at the foot of Heb Lake from 1901 to 2012, actually. Those three lakes are part of the town of Bridgewater's water supply system, so the damming is part of the water supply control system for the town of Bridgewater. Fortunately, though, when the dam was upgraded in 2011, a fishway was installed, and Atlantic whitefish were seen to use it, only for the first time in 2012, and none since then. Upstream passage is now possible into Heb Lake, and we see other fish using the fishway, but no Atlantic whitefish. In this picture, if you look in the foreground of the dam, there's sort of like a metal grating on the ground and then a concrete blockade. That's the beginning of the fishway. There are also invasive fish species in the Petite system. So this is a chain pickerel, and this guy is a smallmouth bass. These species have both been illegally introduced into the Petite system, and they directly prey upon juvenile Atlantic whitefish. So we think that the adult whitefish are outside the size that chain pickerel and smallmouth bass will be attempting to eat. But in the spring, when Atlantic whitefish eggs hatch out, many are consumed, many of like the swim up fry are consumed by chain pickerel and smallmouth bass, as well as other native fish. So it's unclear if any of them make it all the way to the ocean, and if none of them make it to the ocean, there aren't any coming back up to spawn in the fall, which is why we don't see any adult whitefish using the fishway. The final threat I just want to briefly mention, it's not like a huge threat in the petite system, but there is possibility of acidification affecting the waters of the petite and the habitat of the Atlantic whitefish. But this was a much stronger threat to the population in the Tuscan system, and the petite watershed has much more capacity to buffer pH changes due to the geology of the area. But this could become an issue in the case of future increased acid rain or nearby road construction or like mining activities in the area. So what are we doing to help save the Atlantic whitefish? So in the spring of the last 2 years, and this year as well, hopefully, we'll see what happens with the COVID-19 situation, we've been doing larval Atlantic whitefish collections in collaboration with Fisheries and Oceans Canada. So we set up traps in the springtime to capture juvenile Atlantic whitefish right after they hatch. So this is a photo of 2 of the types of traps that we use. So on the left is a rotary screw trap. The way this trap works is that it has 2 pontoons to float it, and it's set up in flowing water, which causes the wheel in the middle to turn. This wheel, it then funnels the fish into a holding box at the rear of the trap, and you can see the holding box is actually open in this photo. There's a colleague of mine who's like looking into the holding box. So on the right, these types of traps are called fyke nets. There's 2 fyke nets in this photo. You can see the holding boxes just at the back there, and then the net kind of works similarly to the rotary screw trap in that it funnels fish into the holding box, but a fyke net can be set up in standing water. You don't need flow, and it doesn't float either. It's attached to the riverbed. So this one, I hope this one works. This is a of some of the larval Atlantic whitefish that we collected last spring. We'll replay it. So they're just in their cooler. We transport them to the Aquatron at Dalhousie University, and then they're cared for staff there. And we're eventually going to be using them to breed and to increase the population in the petite and possibly in other lakes in Nova Scotia. So these ones in the video are fish that were collected in 2019. We did the first year of collections was 2018, and we're hoping to do a 3rd year of collections starting in a couple of weeks. None of the fish that were previously collected are ready to spawn yet, so the 2018 fish will be ready the earliest this coming winter. Once the breeding program is up and running, these fish will be used to increase the population in the petite system, as well as possibly expand to other lakes in Nova Scotia. We also, I mentioned that there's invasive fish species in the petite system. And so we also work to remove the invasive chain pickerel and smallmouth bass from Atlantic whitefish habitat by using 2 methods. So firstly, there's angling that occurs in those lakes, as well as boat electrofishing. So in the picture on the left, one of my colleagues is holding a smallmouth bass that he just hooked and pulled out of the water. And then on the right, this is another of my colleagues, and he is operating the boat electrofisher, the electrofishing boat. We use both methods in combination because angling is better suited to capturing larger fish, whereas boat electrofishing is useful for capturing many smaller fish. So the boat electrofisher uses electricity to stun fish, which are then we net them and sort them out. And so all native fish that we capture using this method are released back into lake unharmed, but the smallmouth bass and the chain pickerel are retained. If you're interested in helping save the Atlantic whitefish, there's a couple things you can do. Firstly, ensure that you can identify the Atlantic whitefish and especially the difference between lake whitefish and Atlantic whitefish. And that's because if you're out angling, you want to be able to release everything that or you want to be able to identify everything that you've caught. But also, if you do incidentally angle an Atlantic whitefish, you want to report that sighting directly to DFO at the phone number that I have here. That phone number is also in the angler's handbook, so it's very easily accessible. There are some specific fishing regulations if you're fishing in the petite area, and those are listed in the angler's handbook. And also, you can help spread awareness about the Atlantic whitefish in your community, because I know that there's still a lot of people who live in Nova Scotia who've never heard of this like very important fish that's only found here. All right, that is the end of my presentation, and it's trivia time.
Cool stuff, Melissa. I see a couple questions in our feed here. So I'm going to give some folks a chance to catch up on the presentation. I know some folks, it looks like they were having a problem with their screens freezing, but I saw you there. So maybe I'll go through these questions while folks catch up on their watching, and then we can answer some of these by the time they get to the end.
Yeah.
There's some really good questions here about the whitefish. So a couple questions about the whitefish themselves. How big are they? And we know that the chain pickerel eat the whitefish, but what do the whitefish eat?
So I'll answer the first question first. So the larval whitefish that we capture in the spring are pretty tiny, like they're 3 to 4 centimeters when we catch them. And the adults that I've seen, the biggest I've seen is 30 centimeters, about 30 centimeters. And then what do they eat? They eat forage fish, so they'll eat small fish, they'll eat insects, and especially the larval whitefish, they'll feed on zooplankton as well.
Cool. I know you said that they are endangered. Maybe you could tell us a bit about how the whitefish came to be designated as endangered and what's going on with these populations that makes us so worried about them.
So the Atlantic whitefish is actually the first species in Canada that was designated as endangered in 1984. So even when the population was even when there was a population in the Tusket, due to there was some overfishing, there's dams in the Tusket, so direct like deaths directly from like the dam infrastructure, and people would also poach them. Happened in the Tusket quite frequently. There's also some anecdotal reports of people using whitefish for fertilizer when there was a very large population, and just because of that, they weren't able to survive in the Tusket anymore. There hasn't been any sightings there since the 80s. And the only other known population is in the Petite, and because of the invasive fish in the Petite, that's not a safe space for them either.
Rough. It's a couple questions here about you guys catching them. How many have you caught, and do you find them a lot, or is it kind of exciting when you find them?
So in the springtime is the only time of year that you can capture the larval fish. So we set up traps specifically during the springtime to capture larval Atlantic whitefish, so that we can then use those ones eventually for a breeding program. It is very exciting. I have personally seen a few adults, but that's very rare. So last spring we caught a couple. Incidentally captured a few adults in one of our rotary screw traps, and those all get released back into the petite system. And then last December 2018, we caught another adult. So we have another rotary screw trap that runs in the fall just to keep removing invasive fish, and that one incidentally captured an adult whitefish as well, and also got released. But yeah, it's quite rare, and it is very exciting.
Yeah, I remember when you guys found a bunch a little while ago. It was very exciting.
Yeah,
I really like this next question. how big are whitefish and are they strong?
Are they strong? So the adults get to be about 30 centimeters, or at least the largest I've seen is about 30 centimeters. Are they strong? The adults that I've seen have looked pretty healthy. The population would be healthier and they might be able to grow bigger if they weren't landlocked in the freshwater lakes. If they were able to go to the ocean and feed there, they probably would be stronger, to use that word.
And I have one more question here about how you fish them. Could you maybe show us those the traps and the boat again and tell us more about electrofishing?
Yeah, let me share my screen again. Hold on. Okay. So yeah, so these are the traps that we use to capture the larval fish. This one's a rotary screw trap. So this one's floating in flowing water. There's a couple pontoons, and then there's the drum in the center that rotates with the flow of water. And then that funnels every fish captured into a holding box at the back. And in the springtime, we go and we check them every single day. About every 24 hours, we check the traps and we remove all of the larval Atlantic whitefish that we find, and then those go to Dalhousie University. So the Fike nets are the other nets in this picture, and they work similarly. Like the wooden, there's two of them in this picture actually. So the wooden holding box is what you can see, and then there's a large net that fish will swim through, and then they end up in the holding box. And same thing, we check them every 24 hours, and we take all of the whitefish out. Any native fish get put back into the water, and then any invasive fish that are incidentally captured in those traps, we remove those guys. And then, so the angling and the boat electrofishing is for removing smallmouth bass and chain pickerel from the petite lakes. So we use angling and boat electrofishing in combination because the angling tends to remove larger fish. Like it's more, you can more easily hook larger fish with angling than remove them with the boat electrofisher. So the boat electrofisher just puts a pulse of water through, pulse of electricity through the water, and all fish in the radius of that pulse get stunned. It doesn't hurt them. They just get knocked out, and then we will net them. So we'll scoop them up out of the water with a net, and then on the electrofishing boat there's a holding box, a live holding box. So they go in there to just to recover. They come back to consciousness, and then we're able to sort out what we've caught and any native fish. So any like white sucker or American eel or yellow perch, white perch, they all get put back into the water, and any smallmouth bass or chain pickerel get they're removed, and we do stomach content surveys on them and measure them and just see how many there are in specific areas. We've never caught any whitefish with the electrofishing boat because in the summer times the whitefish tend to hang out in the in the very deep parts of the lake. They like the cold water, so they hang out in the very deep parts of the lake. And the boat electrofisher, the shock only penetrates like shallow areas. Yeah.
Cool. And how often do you find lake whitefish when you're looking for Atlantic whitefish?
So there's no lake whitefish in the Petite. So it just depends where you are in Nova Scotia. There aren't any lakes, since the Atlantic whitefish are only in our Petite lakes. There aren't any locations that have both. But that's going to be a concern for when I mentioned that we're trying to start a breeding program, and the babies from the breeding program, some of them will go back to the Petite, but some of them might also go into other lakes in Nova Scotia, possibly.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the considerations, is that they can't go into lakes that have lake whitefish due to hybridization concerns. So you want to have Atlantic whitefish, not Atlantic and lake whitefish hybrids.
Yeah, that's tricky. All
Mm-hmm.
right, well, I guess we can wrap this up here and move into trivia. So we know that the Atlantic whitefish is facing a whole bunch of problems. There is only one watershed where they're found now, or we think they're found now. Used to be found in the Tuscan, but aren't now. We're concerned about invasive species like the chain pickerel, which, if you haven't seen them, I've caught a few in Ontario before, and they're massive monsters of fish. I can see how they would be eating whitefish.
Mm-hmm.
And when we start reintroducing, when Coastal Action starts reintroducing fish into some watersheds, we have to be very careful of where we put them. We don't want them hybridizing with lake whitefish, which are a very similar species, and we don't want them just getting eaten up again by, in those lakes where we have a lot of chain pickerel. So
Yeah.
tough to be an Atlantic whitefish. Thank you so much for being here with us, Melissa, and telling us all about Atlantic whitefish. I
Yeah.
learned a lot. I don't know anything about fish. It's very exciting for me. Um, Next week, we actually don't have our topic nailed down. So we are coming back to YouTube Live next week, possibly for a at-risk bird or maybe a plant. I haven't figured out yet. We don't have any plants lined up yet, but I'm working really hard on getting us one because at-risk plants are also super excited.